The video uses AI voice images combined with manual editing. All content is fictional and for entertainment purposes only. Wishing you a relaxing listening experience, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any stories. "You're too big for him," she whispered, before the Mafia boss burned her empire. The rain in Seattle was relentless, a cold, drumming rhythm against the floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass windows of Nico Lombardi's penthouse. He stood perfectly still, a broad-shouldered silhouette against the blurred, bleeding city lights, nursing a tumbler of expensive amber liquid that he hadn't tasted in over an hour. The ice had long since melted, watering down the bourbon just as the relentless passage of time seemed to dilute the satisfaction of his power. Below him, the city moved in blissful ignorance of the storm brewing within the syndicate. To the average citizen, the streets were just slick pavement. To Nico, they were a chessboard. His right-hand man, Elias, a man carved from stone and unquestioning loyalty, waited silently by the massive mahogany desk. "Are you absolutely sure it's her?" Nico asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble, rougher than the thunder echoing outside. "Positive, boss," Elias replied, stepping forward to hand over a sleek, heavy manila folder. "Charlotte Martin. She's the lead architect behind the Viridian redevelopment, the one stalling our waterfront expansion with endless red tape and grassroots organizing." Nico didn't open the folder immediately. He let the heavy cardstock rest in his large hand. He didn't need to see the glossy surveillance pictures. He already knew exactly what she looked like. He'd seen her from afar weeks ago, at a city planning council meeting he had attended in the shadows. She was a woman built of sharp angles and sharper intellect, commanding boardrooms with a quiet, undeniable ferocity that demanded respect even from seasoned, corrupt politicians. She wasn't a part of their dark, bloody world. She was an outsider, a civilian clinging to a stubbornly idealistic vision of a community park, exactly where Nico intended to build the sprawling casino complex that would serve as the cornerstone of his legitimate empire. "She rejected the buyout?" Nico asked, finally flipping the cover open to stare at her face. "Twice," Elias said, a rare hint of unease threading through his stoic tone. "And she didn't just reject it. She told our intermediary that Lombardi money was too soaked in blood and dirt to plant a single tree with. She said it would poison the soil." A dangerous, almost imperceptible smile touched Nico's lips, not quite reaching his cold eyes. It had been years, decades perhaps, since anyone had dared to speak to him with such blatant, unfiltered disregard. Most men trembled at the mere mention of his surname. This woman dared to build a flimsy wall against a tidal wave. "She's bold," Nico murmured, studying the photograph. She had hair the color of roasted chestnuts, pulled back practically, and eyes that held an annoying, piercing amount of clarity. But boldness in this city is often just a mask for fatal naivety. The waterfront expansion wasn't just another business deal. It was Nico's highly orchestrated ticket out of the shadows. It was the fulfillment of a desperate promise he'd made to a father who had died violently on those very docks 20 years ago. Charlotte Martin, armed with nothing but her meticulously drawn blueprints and idealistic community petitions, was standing dead center in the way of a blood-soaked legacy. "What are your orders?" Elias asked, ready to mobilize the men. "Set up a meeting, not her office. Mine," Nico commanded, snapping the folder shut with a sound like a gunshot. "Let's see if this visionary architect can build something strong enough to withstand the weight of my world." 2 days later, Charlotte Martin walked willingly into the lion's den. She didn't look like a woman facing the most feared man in the Pacific Northwest. She wore a tailored slate-gray suit that acted as modern armor, her posture impeccable, carrying nothing but a worn leather portfolio. She politely but firmly refused the offer of a drink from Elias and sat across from Nico. Her gaze was incredibly steady, analyzing him not as a physical threat, but as a complex structural problem that needed dismantling. "Mr. Lombardi," she began, her voice remarkably calm, utterly devoid of the nervous tremor he was so accustomed to hearing from rivals and debtors alike. "I assume this summons isn't about retaining my firm to revamp your interior design aesthetic." Nico leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking slightly as he laced his fingers together. "Miss Martin, I appreciate directness. You are obstructing progress. You are costing me millions by the week. I am here to offer you a permanent solution." "You mean a bribe," she corrected, not missing a single beat, her eyes locking onto his. "I received your last solution. It was remarkably generous and completely, fundamentally unacceptable." "Everyone has a price," Nico stated, his voice dropping a register, morphing into a subtle, vibrating warning. "Perhaps in your world, where everything is a transaction," Charlotte replied smoothly, leaning in just a fraction. "In mine, we value foundations. We build things meant to last. The Viridian Project is about community, about giving oxygen back to a suffocating district. It's not a glaring casino complex thinly disguised as redevelopment. Your money can't buy the soul of that neighborhood, no matter how many zeros you write on the check." Nico felt a sudden, hot flicker of genuine irritation beneath his skin. "You severely underestimate the forces you're playing with, Miss Martin. I am not a smiling politician you can lobby against with protest signs. And you underestimate what ordinary people will fight for when they have absolutely nothing left to lose," she countered, the passion finally breaking through her calm veneer. "I've seen the architectural plans for your casino. It's a glaring eyesore. It is a towering monument to greed that will bleed the locals dry." For a long, heavy moment, silence stretched between them, taut as a piano wire about to snap. Nico stared at her, genuinely and profoundly surprised. She wasn't posturing for a better payout. She believed every single word she was saying. She was a solitary, vibrant orchid, standing violently defiant in a desolate field about to be razed by fire. "I will build on that waterfront, Miss Martin," Nico said, his tone icy, carrying the weight of a decree. "With or without your cooperation." Charlotte stood up smoothly, smoothing out the invisible wrinkles in her skirt. "Then I highly suggest you prepare your legal team and your PR firm for a very long, very public, and very messy fight, Mr. Lombardi, because I won't back down. Not an inch." She turned and walked out, her practical heels clicking decisively and rhythmically against the expensive hardwood floor. Nico watched her go, a strange, entirely unfamiliar sensation settling deep in his chest. It wasn't just anger at her insolence, it was a spark of dark intrigue. She had drawn a line in the sand, daring the devil himself to cross it. And Nico Lombardi never, ever backed down from a challenge. As the heavy oak door clicked shut behind her, Elias stepped out from the adjoining shadow of the room. "Should I have the crew handle her?" Nico remained completely silent for a long time, his dark eyes fixed on the empty doorway where she had stood. He realized with a jolt of surprise that he didn't want her handled. He wanted her to fully understand exactly who she had challenged. "No," Nico finally said, the word heavy in the air. "I'll handle this one myself." But as he poured another drink, the lingering, impossibly out-of-place scent of her faint, floral perfume in his sterile office made him wonder if he was preparing for a territorial battle or something far more complicated. The memory of their abrasive first meeting lingered in Nico's mind like a persistent, echoing bell. He had spent his adult life surrounded by yes-men and terrified rivals. He hadn't expected defiance wrapped in such articulate grace, and he certainly hadn't expected to find that combination so utterly captivating. Charlotte Martin, however, proved she was not easily intimidated by shadows. In the weeks that followed their meeting, she escalated her campaign against his development into a relentless crusade. She rallied the divided city council, organized massive, loud protests blocking the main access roads to the docks, and expertly fed strategic, damaging information to the local press about the devastating environmental and economic impact of his proposed casino. She wasn't just a thorn in his side. She was a brilliant, highly strategic blade aimed directly at his weak points. Nico, accustomed to solving problems with blunt, overwhelming force, found himself forced to play an entirely different, delicate game. He couldn't simply eliminate her or make her disappear. She had made herself too much of a public figure, a martyr for the city's soul. He needed to subtly discredit her, to systematically dismantle her pristine, untouchable reputation from the inside out. He instructed his intelligence team to dig deep into her past, searching for any scrap of leverage. They scoured financial records, old relationships, and family history. They found painfully little: a stellar, flawless academic record, a struggling but highly respected independent architectural firm, and a quiet, almost boring personal life. The only glowing red anomaly was a significant, recurring, and draining monthly donation to a small, extremely private rehabilitation facility across the border in Oregon. "It's her younger brother," Elias explained, tossing a surprisingly thin file onto Nico's desk. "Julian Martin. Severe, spiraling gambling addiction. He owed a massive amount of money to the wrong people before she forced him to check in." Nico studied the file, tracing the lines of Julian's haggard face, a cold, calculating strategy forming in his mind. It was a glaring vulnerability, a hairline crack in her impenetrable armor. Who exactly did he owe? "The Romanos," Elias replied grimly, naming a brutal, volatile rival syndicate Nico had been slowly, methodically, trying to edge out of the city's supply lines for years. A plan, intricate and ruthless, began to take sharp shape. Nico didn't just want the waterfront anymore. He wanted Charlotte to viscerally realize the absolute futility of fighting a man like him. He decided to leverage her brother's staggering debt, not to destroy her entirely, but to force her hand and make her submit. He arranged a carefully orchestrated chance encounter at a high society charity gala she was known to attend yearly. It was a stifling world of forced, porcelain smiles, expensive champagne, and whispered, venomous gossip, a far cry from the gritty, blood-stained reality of their underlying conflict. Charlotte looked breathtaking in a simple, flowing midnight blue gown, navigating the crowded room with a practiced, elegant grace that made the wealthy socialites around her look clumsy. Nico approached her smoothly, intercepting a passing waiter to hand her a delicate crystal glass of champagne. "Miss Martin, the city is large, yet we keep running into each other." She accepted the glass with a slow, cautious nod, her intelligent eyes immediately wary and defensive. "Mr. Lombardi, I somehow imagine you're not here to bid on the silent auction for modern art." "I'm here for a conversation," Nico said, his voice dropping low enough that only she could hear it over the string quartet. "A strictly private one." He placed a gentle but firm hand on the small of her back, guiding her away from the prying eyes and towards a secluded stone balcony overlooking the glittering city skyline. The night air was crisp and biting, the dull roar of the gala muffled behind the heavy, soundproof glass doors. "You're making things incredibly difficult for me, Charlotte," Nico began, intentionally dropping the formality of her surname. "That's entirely the point," she replied sharply, refusing to look away from the sprawling city below. "I'm protecting my project and the people who live here." "Your project is a rapidly sinking ship," Nico stated bluntly, moving into her line of sight. "And I am the only one holding a lifeline." "I would rather drown than take a lifeline from you." Nico took a slow step closer, letting his imposing physical presence fill the small space. "Are you absolutely sure about that? Because your little brother, Julian, seems to be in desperate, immediate need of one." Charlotte stiffened instantly, the warm color draining completely from her face, leaving her looking like marble. "Leave him out of this. He has nothing, absolutely nothing to do with our business. He has everything to do with it now," Nico countered softly, a velvet threat. "He owes a highly significant sum to the Romanos. You know their reputation. They are not known for their charity or their patience. I, on the other hand, am willing to instantly clear his massive debt. Consider it a gesture of goodwill towards our future partnership." Charlotte's eyes flashed with a potent, explosive mixture of terror and furious indignation. "You invaded my privacy. You investigated my broken family. You're blackmailing me." "I am merely offering a logical transaction," Nico corrected, his face an unreadable mask. "I cleared Julian's debt with a single phone call, ensuring his physical safety. You withdraw your zoning opposition to the waterfront development tomorrow morning. It's a remarkably simple exchange. There's nothing simple about you or your world," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Not from the chill in the air, but from a profound, deep-seated anger that seemed to shake her very core. Nico felt a sudden, entirely unexpected, and incredibly sharp pang of guilt pierce his chest. He had intended to break her resolve, to see her yield, but seeing the raw vulnerability and genuine fear in her eyes, he realized he had struck a much deeper, more painful chord than he ever intended. He was crossing a moral line he rarely crossed, using innocent, sick family members as expendable pawns on his board. "I will not let you ruin him, and I will not let them hurt him," Charlotte said, her voice dropping to a fierce, desperate whisper. "And I will not let you ruin the waterfront. I will find another way. I always do." She turned sharply and practically fled back into the crowded, brightly lit ballroom, leaving Nico standing alone in the cold on the balcony. He had fully expected her to capitulate under the pressure. Instead, she had dug her heels in even deeper. He had profoundly miscalculated. He had severely underestimated her fiercely protective loyalty to her brother and her unyielding, iron-clad moral compass. As he watched her dark blue dress disappear into the sea of superficial guests, Nico realized with a sinking feeling that this was no longer just about a lucrative piece of real estate. It was rapidly becoming a highly personal battle of wills, and for the absolute first time in his hardened life, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to win if it meant permanently destroying the very fire that made her so fascinatingly formidable. The rules of the game had fundamentally changed, and Nico Lombardi was suddenly flying blind. The bitter taste of the gala encounter lingered in Nico's mouth long after the night ended. He was a man deeply accustomed to executing ruthless, emotionless negotiations, but weaponizing Julian Martin's addiction felt palpably different. It felt distinctly, uncomfortably dishonorable. The realization that he cared about the distinction deeply unsettled him. The next morning, his deliberate attempts to focus on the syndicate's complex, legitimate logistics were constantly thwarted by the intrusive memory of Charlotte's fierce, tear-filled defiance. He had demanded submission. He had been met with pure, unadulterated contempt. His private intercom buzzed, the sound jarring him from his thoughts. It was Elias. "Boss, we have a rapidly escalating situation. It's regarding the Romanos and the Martin kid." Nico's stomach tightened into a knot of cold dread. "What happened? Give it to me straight." "The Romanos got incredibly impatient," Elias said, his voice tighter than usual. "They didn't wait for your proposed transaction. They breached the Oregon facility and grabbed Julian from rehab at dawn this morning." Nico stood up with such explosive force that his heavy leather chair skidded violently backward, slamming against the window. "Where did they take him?" "A meat-packing warehouse in the industrial district by the rail yards. They're demanding the total debt plus an exorbitant inconvenience interest by midnight tonight, or they promised to send him back to his sister in small, unidentifiable pieces." A freezing, terrifyingly familiar rage washed over Nico, instantly overriding the unfamiliar, nagging guilt from the night before. This was a direct, brazen challenge to his authority, his territory, and his implicit control over the entire city's underworld. But buried deeper than the territorial insult was a sudden, sharp, agonizing fear for Charlotte. If Julian was tortured or killed, she would completely shatter. And Nico found, to his own profound shock, that he could not bear the thought of being the architect of her destruction. "Assemble the breach team," Nico ordered, his voice devoid of all human emotion, a sure, terrifying sign to Elias that he was about to unleash hell on earth. "Heavy ordnance. We move right now." The warehouse was predictably heavily guarded, reeking of rust and old blood. But Nico's men were elite professionals, moving with silent, lethal precision. The raid was fast, brutal, and overwhelmingly violent, a chaotic, deafening symphony of automatic gunfire, shattering glass, and desperately shouted orders. Nico, leading the charge through the metal doors himself, felt a massive surge of pure adrenaline he hadn't experienced in years. This wasn't about business margins. This was about violently reclaiming control, and perhaps on a subconscious level, about desperately trying to fix a catastrophic mistake he had set in motion. They found Julian badly battered, bleeding from his mouth, and utterly terrified, bound tightly to a wooden chair in the freezing center of the warehouse. He was a younger, much frailer, broken version of Charlotte, his eyes wide with animal panic as Nico approached through the gun smoke. "Lombardi," one of the Romano lieutenants spat, coughing up blood on the concrete floor, clutching a shattered knee. "This isn't your damn fight. It's just a junkie." "It is now," Nico said coldly, not sparing the man a second glance as he gestured for Elias to cut the thick ropes, binding Julian loose. The drive back to the city was suffocatingly tense. Julian, violently trembling and completely silent, clutched a thick thermal blanket around his thin shoulders in the back of the armored SUV. Nico didn't speak a word to him. His mind was already rapidly calculating the immense political fallout. He had saved the brother, yes, but by doing so, he had effectively plunged his entire organization into an all-out gang war with the Romanos. He ordered Elias to take Julian to his most secure, heavily fortified safe house outside the city limits. Then, he did something entirely unprecedented, something that went against every rule of self-preservation he had ever learned. He ordered the driver to go to Charlotte's architectural firm. It was nearly 2 a.m., the massive office building, mostly dark and empty. He found her standing exhaustedly over a massive drafting table, her shoulders slumped, the sharp, formidable lines of her usual demeanor significantly softened by sheer, overwhelming exhaustion. When she looked up and saw his hulking silhouette in the doorway, she instinctively stepped back, her expression instantly hardening into a mask of hostility. "What on earth are you doing here?" she demanded, her voice tight with stress and anger. Haven't you done enough damage for 1 week?" "Julian is safe," Nico said bluntly, omitting any polite pleasantries. "He's heavily guarded at a secure, undisclosed location." Charlotte froze completely, the expensive drafting pencil slipping from her numb fingers and clattering loudly onto the floor. "What? What do you mean he's safe? From what?" "The Romanos took him this morning from the clinic," Nico explained, forcing his voice to remain steady. "I intervened with my team. He's shaken, but he's physically unharmed. He needs to stay completely out of sight for a few days while I handle the fallout." He had somewhat expected a wave of relief, perhaps even a begrudging, whispered, "Thank you." Instead, Charlotte's face turned completely pale, and she stormed across the room, stopping mere inches from him, completely disregarding his physical size. Her eyes blazed with a terrifying mixture of righteous anger and raw, protective fear. "You caused this!" she accused, her voice trembling with fury, her finger jabbing at his chest. "You pushed them. You dug into his life. You used him as a cheap pawn in your sick game, and they reacted. You put a massive target on a sick man's back." "I extracted him. I saved his life tonight," Nico countered, genuinely stung by the harsh accusation, even though the cold, logical part of his brain knew there was undeniable truth in her words. "Because you wanted to hoard the leverage for yourself," she yelled, her iron composure finally, completely breaking, tears spilling over her lashes. "You don't care about him. You don't care about anyone or anything. Everything, every single human life, is just a cold transaction to you." She was right, and the absolute truth of it felt like a brutal, physical blow to his gut. For years he had operated strictly on the survival principle that emotional detachment equaled power. But standing before this fierce, broken woman, seeing the hot tears she furiously blinked away, the most feared man in Seattle felt incredibly, pathetically small. "I didn't intend for him to get hurt. That wasn't the plan," Nico said softly, the words feeling pitifully inadequate even to his own ears. "Your intentions don't matter, Nico. Only your violent actions," Charlotte replied bitterly, stepping away from him as if he were diseased. "Keep my brother safe, and stay the hell away from me." She turned her back to him, staring blindly at the complex blueprints on the wall, her shoulders shaking silently. Nico stood there in the doorway for a long, agonizing moment, the silence in the office heavy and profoundly oppressive. He had won the bloody skirmish with the Romanos, but he had undeniably lost something far more significant in this brightly lit room. He turned and walked away, the click of the door echoing loudly down the empty hallway. He had always prided himself on being a master manipulator, but he realized tonight that he had manipulated himself right into a corner. He had saved the brother, but he had undeniably lost the sister, and the very thought of it left a hollow, gnawing ache in his chest. He couldn't even begin to explain. The messy aftermath of the warehouse raid was a raging tempest of bloody retaliatory strikes and incredibly tense back-channel negotiations. The syndicate was officially at war with the Romano family, and Nico found his resources stretched dangerously thin. He was practically living in his war room, managing the escalating street violence, while desperately trying to maintain the fragile facade of his legitimate corporate empire to his clean investors. Yet, amidst the overwhelming chaos, the gunfire and the boardroom lies, the one glaring constant was his unexpected, consuming fixation on Charlotte Martin. He had strictly kept his word, ensuring Julian remained securely locked down in a heavily guarded safe house, personally footing the exorbitant bill for a private, top-tier addiction counselor to continue the young man's treatment on site. He demanded and received detailed daily reports on Julian's progress, not because he particularly cared about the kid's sobriety, but because he knew, deep down, that Charlotte did. She hadn't contacted him once since that explosive night in her office. The absolute silence from her end was far more punishing than her screams had been. 2 grueling weeks later, Elias entered Nico's office, looking more exhausted and grim than Nico had ever seen him. "The Romanos hit one of our main shipping supply routes last night. It's getting incredibly messy out there, boss. We are bleeding money. We need to legally secure the waterfront deal fast to offset the massive losses, or the Silent Commission will start asking dangerous questions about your leadership." Nico rubbed his throbbing temples, the immense stress manifesting as a physical, crushing weight on his shoulders. The waterfront. The very plot of dirt that had started this entire bloody, emotional mess. "And Miss Martin's firm?" Nico asked, though he already knew the frustrating answer. "Still legally blocking every single permit," Elias said with a sigh. "She hasn't backed down an inch. In fact, she's escalating. She's organizing a massive, city-wide rally at the site for this coming weekend." Nico knew he had to act definitively. The gang war was draining resources rapidly, and the stalling waterfront project was a glaring beacon of weakness he simply couldn't afford to show his enemies. But the mere thought of forcing Charlotte's hand again, of using threats to break her spirit, physically repulsed him. He decided on an entirely different, incredibly risky approach. He needed a ceasefire. He needed a truce. He found her late that afternoon at the actual site of the proposed Viridian Park, inspecting a desolate plot of overgrown, trash-filled land. She looked incredibly tired, dark, bruised circles resting under her eyes, her hair tied in a messy bun, but her focus on the land remained intense and unwavering. When she saw his ominous black SUV pull up to the curb, she didn't run. She simply stood her ground amidst the weeds, her jaw set in a hard line. Nico stepped out slowly, leaving his heavily armed guards by the car. He approached her across the uneven ground, his hands open and clearly visible. A deliberate, universal gesture of non-aggression. "I distinctly remember telling you to stay away from me," she said, her voice frosty enough to freeze the humid air. "I need 5 minutes of your time," Nico requested, his tone completely stripped of its usual commanding, arrogant edge. "Just 5 minutes, Charlotte." "Please." She hesitated, her eyes darting to his guards. Then she crossed her arms tightly over her chest, erecting a defensive physical barrier. "You have exactly 3. Nico took a deep breath, smelling the damp earth. "The situation with the Romanos is rapidly escalating out of my immediate control. It's becoming highly dangerous for absolutely anyone even tangentially connected to me." "I am not connected to you," she snapped back instantly. "Julian is," Nico pointed out gently, hating to use the name, but knowing it was necessary. "They know I personally intervened for him. While he's locked in my safe house, he's a prime target. And while you are so loudly opposing my development, you are putting yourself in the crossfire." A flash of genuine fear appeared in her eyes, though she quickly masked it with fierce defiance. "Are you threatening me again, Nico? Because it won't work." "I am warning you," Nico said earnestly, stepping just a fraction closer. "This isn't about the casino permits anymore. It's about a literal street war, and you are standing directly on the battlefield without any armor." Charlotte looked away from him, staring sadly at the overgrown weeds that she envisioned as a playground. "What do you want from me, Nico?" It was the very first time she had used his first name, without venom, and it sent an unexpected, warm jolt straight through his chest. "A truce," he said simply. "Suspend your media campaign against the waterfront, just for now. Let the political heat die down. In exchange, I personally guarantee Julian's absolute safety until the Romanos are permanently dealt with, and I will fully fund the remainder of his rehab, wherever you want him to go." She looked back at him, her expression intensely searching, trying to decipher the hidden motives behind the monster she thought she knew. "Why? Why on earth would you do that for me?" "Because I severely miscalculated," Nico admitted, the heavy confession feeling utterly foreign and strange on his tongue. "I arrogantly brought this violent danger directly to your door. I have a fundamental responsibility to fix it." It was the closest Nico Lombardi had ever come to offering a genuine apology in his entire life. Charlotte studied his face for a long, agonizingly silent minute. She saw the deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the subtle, humbled shift in his imposing demeanor. He wasn't the arrogant, untouchable mob boss who had tried to buy her off with a check. He looked like a weary man carrying the entire weight of a broken world. "A temporary suspension," she finally agreed, her voice tight but decisive. "Only until Julian is safe and relocated. And if you break your word to me, Nico, I swear to God I will make it my life's mission to utterly ruin you, syndicate or no syndicate." "I don't doubt it for a second," Nico said, a very faint, deeply genuine smile touching his lips. The truce was incredibly fragile, built on absolute necessity and mutual deep-seated distrust. But it was a starting point. As Nico drove away from the desolate lot, he felt a strange, profound sense of relief wash over him. He had legally secured a pause in her campaign. Yes, but more importantly, he had bridged the massive, dark chasm between them, however slightly. Late that evening, as he sat in the dark, reviewing bloody security reports, his encrypted private phone buzzed on the desk. It was a brief text message from an unknown number. "Thank you for keeping him safe today." Nico stared at the glowing screen for a long, quiet time. He didn't type a reply, but a quiet, unfamiliar sense of deep satisfaction settled over him. The brutal war outside raged on in the streets, but inside his own mind, a completely different kind of battle had just taken an unexpected, irreversible turn. He had secured a truce, but he had a sinking feeling. The real, heart-wrenching complication was only just beginning. The fragile truce held, a tense, uneasy ceasefire right in the middle of a war zone. The loud, public fight over the waterfront zoning quieted to a whisper, replaced by the grim, daily reality of the syndicate's violent conflict with the Romanos. Nico was entirely consumed by the logistics of violence, orchestrating targeted strikes, managing highly volatile, greedy alliances, and trying desperately to keep the bloodshed contained away from civilian eyes. Yet, amidst the deafening chaos, his stray thoughts continually, uncontrollably drifted back to Charlotte. He found himself actively looking for weak excuses to check on her well-being. He had his elite security team discreetly monitor her daily movements, internally justifying it as protecting a vital asset. He soon knew the quiet rhythm of her life, the specific indie coffee shop she visited precisely at 7:15 a.m., the incredibly late, grueling hours she kept at her firm, the rare, peaceful moments she sat alone on a park bench by the water, sketching furiously into a worn notebook. He was profoundly fascinated by her unyielding drive, her absolute, unwavering commitment to her vision of a better city, even when she was constantly surrounded by the overwhelming ugliness of his world. One particularly rainy evening, utterly exhausted after a grueling, hours-long shouting match with the old guard syndicate bosses, Nico found himself mindlessly directing his driver toward her office building. It was well past midnight, and a single, warm yellow light burned on the third floor. He instructed his driver to wait and went up alone, smoothly bypassing the building's locked doors with practiced criminal ease. He found her fast asleep at her massive drafting table, her cheek resting softly on a scattered, chaotic pile of oversized blueprints. A half-empty cup of cold, forgotten coffee sat precariously near her elbow. Nico stood silently in the doorway, just watching the steady rise and fall of her breathing. In sleep, the fierce, intimidating determination was completely gone, replaced by a soft vulnerability that made his chest ache with an emotion he couldn't name. He walked quietly towards her, intending only to make sure she was safe and perhaps leave his coat over her shoulders. As he reached the table, his eyes snagged on the specific blueprints she had been obsessively working on. They weren't for the modest Viridian Park she had been championing. They were massive, highly detailed, rough sketches of a sprawling, state-of-the-art community center, complete with an expansive public library, a free health clinic, and multi-level green spaces. At the very top of the main page, written in her neat, precise architectural handwriting, was the title, The Lombardy Initiative. Nico froze entirely. He carefully, holding his breath, pulled the top sheet out from under her resting arm. He studied the intricate, brilliant designs, the incredibly thoughtful integration of the community's deepest needs. She had taken his selfish, ego-driven ambition for a personal legacy and brilliantly transformed it into something genuinely benevolent and lasting. She hadn't given up on her high ideals at all. She was actively trying to merge them with his massive financial resources. A sudden, fierce, overwhelming wave of protectiveness surged through his veins. He had spent his entire adult life building a dark empire of fear, and this incredible woman was quietly, painstakingly trying to build an empire of hope, using his tainted name to do it. Charlotte stirred suddenly, blinking heavily against the harsh, fluorescent overhead light. She saw his massive frame standing there, holding her private sketch, and she immediately sat bolt upright, sheer panic flashing violently in her eyes. "What are you doing here?" she demanded, aggressively snatching the large paper right out of his hand. "How did you even get in here?" "The front lock is merely a suggestion," Nico said mildly, though his heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. "What exactly is this, Charlotte?" She clutched the crumpled sketch tightly to her chest, her chin lifting in that familiar, defensive posture. "It's absolutely nothing. Just a theoretical design exercise to keep my mind busy." "Don't lie to me," Nico said softly, taking a slow step closer. "It has my family name printed right on it." Charlotte sighed deeply, all the fight suddenly draining out of her as she ran a frustrated hand through her disheveled hair. "It's a compromise. I was thinking, if you're going to forcefully bulldoze your way onto the waterfront no matter what I do, I thought, maybe there was a way to make the project actually benefit the city, to heal it, not just line your bank account." She clearly expected anger, perhaps cruel mockery at her naivety. Instead, Nico slowly pulled up a drafting stool and sat directly across from her. "Show me," he said, his voice thick with genuine curiosity. Charlotte hesitated for a long moment, eyeing him suspiciously, then slowly laid the large blueprint flat on the table. For the next hour, they didn't speak a single word about the syndicate, the looming threat of the Romanos, or the constant danger surrounding them. They spoke deeply of architecture, of pressing community needs, of the crucial interplay of natural light and open space. Charlotte's passion was incredibly infectious, and Nico found himself genuinely, deeply engaged, asking highly specific questions, offering structural suggestions based on construction logistics he understood far better than she did. It was an incredibly intimate, quiet, and profound collaboration in the dead of night, a bizarre, beautiful bubble of normalcy amidst a raging storm. "You do realize," Nico said, tracing a finger over the finalized sketch of the clinic, "that this would cost significantly more to build and maintain than the casino." But it would leave a legacy, Charlotte countered fiercely, holding his gaze without flinching. A real, lasting one. A foundation. Not a hollow monument built on exploiting human vice and desperation. Nico looked at her, truly seeing her for the first time. He saw the brilliant intelligence, the deep, abiding kindness, the quiet, unyielding strength that was slowly, systematically dismantling his carefully constructed, cynical worldview. "Do you honestly think I'm a man capable of building something like this?" he asked, his voice dropping to a vulnerable whisper. "I think you are capable of being absolutely anything you choose to be," she replied softly, her eyes searching his. The very air between them crackled with electricity, the old animosity entirely replaced by a potent, terrifying, and magnetic connection. Nico realized, with a sudden sense of utter dread and beautiful inevitability, that he was rapidly falling for her. The ruthless, untouchable Mafia boss was falling desperately in love with the idealistic architect. Before he could even begin to process the massive implications of that thought, his encrypted phone completely shattered the quiet silence. It was Elias. "Boss?" Elias's voice was strained and out of breath. "The Romanos. They somehow bypassed our perimeter security at the safe house. It was a bloodbath. They have Julian again." The fragile, beautiful bubble violently burst. The horrific reality of Nico's violent world crashed back down, ugly and unavoidable. He saw the color instantly drain from Charlotte's face as she clearly heard Elias's frantic words echoing through the phone's speaker. "I have to go," Nico said, his voice instantly turning ice cold, the heavy, emotionless mask of the boss violently slipping back into place. He turned sharply toward the door, leaving her entirely alone in the brightly lit office, the beautiful blueprints of a better future lying ignored on the table, completely overshadowed by the immediate, violent, present danger he had sworn to protect her from. The frantic ride to the tactical extraction point was a chaotic blur of rapid-fire communication and deeply suppressed, homicidal rage. The Romanos hadn't just snatched Julian. They had brazenly ambushed the fortified safe house, leaving 3 of Nico's most loyal men bleeding out on the floor. It was a massive, unforgivable escalation, a point of no return, a declaration of absolute, all-out war. Nico's strategic mind raced at 1,000,000 miles an hour. The Romanos were clearly desperate, sensing a fatal weakness because Nico had diverted crucial resources to play bodyguard for the Martin siblings. They had found his sole vulnerability, and they were squeezing it. He arrived rapidly at the warehouse district, a different, much larger location this time, a sprawling, decaying, abandoned shipyard near the edge of the water. His assault team was already in strict position, heavily armed, clad in tactical gear, and waiting silently for his ultimate command. "They have him pinned down in the main structural hangar," Elias reported, his face grim and smeared with rain. "It's heavily fortified. Concrete walls. We're looking at highly significant, unacceptable casualties if we attempt a full frontal breach." "We breach," Nico ordered coldly, cocking his weapon. "Take no prisoners, no survivors. They crossed a line they can't uncross." The coordinated assault was intensely chaotic and unspeakably bloody. Nico fought with a terrifying, detached ferocity, entirely driven by a singular, burning purpose. He had looked Charlotte in the eye and promised he would keep her brother safe, and he had catastrophically failed. He absolutely could not fail her again. They fought their way violently into the cavernous main hangar. Amidst the deafening roar of gunfire and the desperate shouting, Nico saw Julian. He was tied viciously to a thick structural pillar, looking badly beaten but miraculously alive. Standing directly next to him, using the boy as a human shield, was Vincent Romano, the aging, ruthless head of the rival family. "Hold your fire!" Vincent roared over the fading din, pressing the cold barrel of a heavy handgun directly against Julian's temple. The shooting ceased abruptly, replaced by an agonizing, ringing silence, heavy with the suffocating smell of cordite and copper. Nico stepped forward out of the shadows, his own weapon lowered slightly, but instantly ready. "This ends tonight, Vincent," Nico said, his deep voice echoing ominously in the cavernous, empty space. "It absolutely does," Vincent sneered, sweat beading on his forehead. "But not how you think, Lombardi. You've gotten pathetic. You've gotten soft, playing the noble protector for a loudmouth civilian and her junkie brother. It makes you weak. The Commission sees it." "Let the kid go," Nico demanded, his eyes locked on Vincent. "This is strictly between you and me. Always has been." "It's about total respect," Vincent spat, his hand shaking slightly. "You thought you could just quietly take over the entire city's operations. I'm violently taking back what's rightfully mine, and I'm starting by eliminating your leverage." Vincent's finger visibly tightened on the trigger. Time seemed to physically slow down, thick as molasses. Nico clearly saw the stark, paralyzing terror in Julian's young eyes. He vividly saw the inevitable, bloody tragedy unfolding, a tragedy that would irreparably destroy Charlotte's soul. He didn't think. He relied on decades of muscle memory. He reacted. Nico raised his weapon in a blur and fired, a single, devastatingly precise shot. At the exact same fraction of a second, Vincent pulled his trigger. Vincent stumbled backward violently, a massive red stain instantly blooming on his chest, dropping his weapon as he fell hard to the concrete. Julian cried out in shock, slumping heavily against the thick ropes. Nico rushed forward, his heart pounding a frantic, painful rhythm. He quickly pulled a knife and cut Julian loose. The boy was sobbing, bleeding heavily from a superficial but painful graze on his temple, where Vincent's panicked shot had narrowly missed its fatal mark. But he was alive. "Get him out of this slaughterhouse," Nico barked at Elias, not taking his eyes off the boy. "Take him straight to the private underground clinic. Full security detail. Nobody gets in." As Elias hauled the violently shaking Julian away toward the exits, Nico stood silently over Vincent Romano's lifeless body. The street war was effectively over. He had won. He had secured his undisputed empire. But as he looked down at the blood coating his own hands, he didn't feel the rush of being victorious. He felt the heavy, suffocating, nauseating weight of his horrific reality. He had successfully saved Julian, but he had done it through the only language he truly knew: extreme violence. He returned to his silent penthouse hours later, the adrenaline finally fading, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. He poured a heavy drink, staring blankly out at the sparkling city lights. He had undeniably won the war, but he knew with sickening certainty he was about to lose the only thing that had started to truly matter. His phone buzzed loudly on the glass table. It was Charlotte. "Is he—" Her voice was nothing but a terrified, breathless whisper. "He's alive," Nico said, his voice incredibly rough, throat burning. "He's heavily guarded at the clinic. He has a graze on his head, but he's going to be okay. The Romanos are entirely dismantled. They are no longer a threat." There was a very long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. He could clearly hear her shaky, uneven breathing. "I'm coming to see him right now," she finally said. "I'll have a secure car pick you up immediately," Nico offered softly. "No," she said quickly, sharply, recoiling from the offer. "I'll go myself. And Nico, please don't be there when I arrive." The line went dead with a hollow click. Nico stared at the darkened phone screen. He had fully expected screaming anger, perhaps hysterical relief. He hadn't expected the absolute, chilling finality in her voice. He had kept his ultimate promise, but the brutal violence required to do so had terrified her, pushing her completely and permanently away. He had fully shown her the true, horrific face of his world, and she had rightfully recoiled. He had saved her brother, but he realized with a sinking, devastating heart that he had lost her completely. The massive empire was utterly secure, but the heavy throne had never felt so cold, isolated, and entirely empty. The quiet weeks following the brutal collapse of the Romano Syndicate were the most eerily silent the city had seen in decades. Nico's violent consolidation of power was absolute and terrifying. He was the undisputed, untouchable king of the Pacific Northwest underworld, his vast, legitimate corporate businesses flourishing right alongside the illicit operations. The massive waterfront development was moving forward rapidly, unimpeded by protests or red tape. Yet, Nico Lombardi was nothing but a hollow ghost haunting his own empire. He moved mechanically through the daily motions of leadership, issuing orders and making high-stakes decisions with a cold, robotic efficiency that unnerved even his closest captains. He completely stopped visiting the waterfront construction sites. He refused to even look at the finalized blueprints for the massive casino. The ultimate victory felt like ash in his mouth, the immense wealth completely meaningless. He hadn't seen a single glimpse of Charlotte since the bloody night he rescued Julian. She had stubbornly kept her word. She had completely vanished from his life. She had quietly overseen Julian's immediate medical transfer to a highly secure, anonymous facility out of state, and her once thriving architectural firm had mysteriously broken its lease and relocated its offices overnight. She was gone, leaving behind a deafening silence that threatened to drive him mad. Elias, ever observant, noticed the drastic change. "Boss, you've been working non-stop for weeks. The commission is highly satisfied with the revenue. You should take a break, take a trip, celebrate the monopoly." "There is absolutely nothing to celebrate," Nico replied curtly, staring dead-eyed out the massive window of his penthouse at the rain. He knew exactly what was wrong. The fleeting taste of normalcy, the brief, intoxicating glimpse of a radically different, purposeful life he had shared with Charlotte over those clinic blueprints, had completely poisoned him against his own grim reality. He had finally realized, with devastating clarity, that he didn't want the bloody empire he had ruthlessly built. He desperately wanted the bright one she had designed. One evening, utterly unable to bear the suffocating silence of his massive penthouse, he found himself driving aimlessly toward the waterfront. The site was no longer an overgrown, hopeful lot. It was a massive, loud construction zone, the imposing steel skeleton of the casino beginning to violently rise against the city skyline. He parked and walked slowly onto the muddy site, completely ignoring the panicked security guards who scrambled frantically to clear his path. He stood amidst the cold steel and pouring concrete, looking up at the monstrous structure he had fought so hard and bled so much to build. It was exactly as Charlotte had accurately described it, a towering, soulless monument to greed. He distinctly remembered her challenging words. "Do you honestly think I'm a man capable of building something like this?" he had asked. "I think you are capable of being absolutely anything you choose to be," she had replied with such infuriating faith. He had chosen this. He had actively chosen the fear, the violence, the profound isolation. A sudden, overwhelming wave of absolute disgust washed over him. He wasn't building a family legacy. He was building a massive, gilded tomb. He had spent his entire life viciously fighting for control, only to realize he was hopelessly trapped within the very cage he had constructed. He pulled out his phone and dialed Elias. "Halt all construction on the waterfront immediately," Nico ordered. his voice steadier and clearer than it had been in months. "Boss? What do you mean?" Elias sounded genuinely bewildered. "We have all the city permits. We're finally ahead of schedule. I said halt it. Tell the contractors to pack up their gear and go home. We're entirely shutting it down. But the board, the investors, the millions we've already sunk into the foundation." "I don't care about the money," Nico interrupted sharply. "It's over." He hung up, the massive decision feeling final and liberating. He was tearing it all down. Not just the physical casino, but the entire criminal empire itself. He had reached the absolute pinnacle of his dark world, and he realized he wanted no part of the view. The deliberate dismantling of the Lombardi syndicate was intensely chaotic and incredibly dangerous. Nico began systematically, ruthlessly divesting his illicit assets, violently cutting ties with the ruling commission, and quietly funneling his massive legitimate wealth into a newly formed, heavily protected blind trust. The entire underworld was thrown into absolute turmoil, wild rumors swirling that the great Lombardi had completely lost his mind. He faced multiple, coordinated assassination attempts from greedy lieutenants, fierce mutinies, and the overwhelming fury of his former, powerful allies. But he fought them all off, not with the intention of maintaining his rule, but with the desperate intention of fully escaping it. He was actively burning his empire to the ground, brick by bloody brick. It took 6 grueling, exhausting months. 6 months of intense paranoia, calculated violence, and meticulous, flawless legal planning. He transferred his few remaining loyal men, including Elias, to highly paid legitimate security firms, paid off all outstanding debts, and permanently severed the final, rotting ties to his criminal past. When the thick dust finally settled, Nico Lombardi was no longer a feared Mafia boss. He was simply a man with a considerable clean fortune, a heavily scarred soul, and a massive list of enemies. He stood alone in his vast, empty penthouse, the expensive furniture sold, the priceless artwork gone. He held a single battered file folder in his hand, the highly classified dossier his intelligence team had compiled on Charlotte Martin, recently updated with her new, remote location. He had burned his entire world to ashes for the incredibly slim chance to step into hers. He had completely dismantled the syndicate to prove to himself, and perhaps praying to her, that he was truly capable of choosing a different, better path. He didn't know if she would ever forgive him, or if she would even agree to see his face. But he knew, with absolute certainty, he couldn't live in the dark shadows anymore. He desperately needed the light. He needed the brilliant architect who had shown him the blueprint for a better life. He walked out of the empty penthouse, leaving the gold keys on the bare kitchen counter, and headed straight for the airport. The Dark Empire was gone. It was finally time to find the Orchid. The incredibly small, rainy coastal town in Oregon was an entire world away from the gritty, towering skyline of Seattle. It smelled strongly of salt spray and dense pine, a quiet, slow-paced place where people actually knew their neighbors, and the loudest noise was the rhythmic crashing of the gray waves against the cliffs. Nico had spent 2 agonizing weeks here, keeping an incredibly low profile, simply watching her from a distance. Charlotte had opened a very modest, charming storefront office right on the main street. She looked remarkably different, significantly more relaxed. The sharp, defensive tension he remembered so well entirely replaced by a quiet, radiant contentment. She was spending her days designing local, meaningful community projects, small family homes, and a beautiful new children's wing for the town library. He had waited, gathering the kind of emotional courage he rarely lacked in his former, violent life. He was no longer the intimidating, untouchable boss. He was simply a flawed man asking for a second chance he wasn't entirely sure he deserved. On a heavily rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly the kind of miserable weather they had first met in, Nico finally pushed open the door and walked into her office. A cheerful brass bell chimed above the door. Charlotte was standing at a drafting table, her back turned to him. She didn't turn around immediately, focused on a line. "I'll be right with you," she said, her voice clear, bright and musical. Nico stood perfectly still, his massive heart hammering violently against his ribs. He waited in the silence. She finally turned, a welcoming, professional smile on her face that instantly, completely froze. The warm color completely drained from her cheeks, and she gripped the hard edge of the drafting table so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her eyes went wide with profound shock and a sudden, sharp, terrible fear. "Nico," she breathed, the heavy name sounding like both a desperate prayer and a terrifying curse. "Hello, Charlotte," he said quietly, keeping his large hands completely visible at his sides, stepping no further into the small room. She immediately glanced frantically toward the large street window, as if fully expecting a fleet of armed black SUVs to pull up. "What are you doing here? How on earth did you find me?" "It wasn't easy," he admitted, his voice soft. "But I desperately needed to see you." "I clearly told you to stay away from us," she said, her voice trembling slightly with suppressed emotion. "Julian is finally safe here. We're safe here. Please, I am begging you, don't bring your violent world here." "I haven't," Nico said, taking a very slow, highly deliberate step forward. "My world is completely gone, Charlotte. It doesn't exist anymore." She frowned deeply, profound confusion violently warring with her fear. "What do you mean, gone? The syndicate, the casino project, all of it." Nico watched her face closely, desperately hoping she would understand the magnitude of his words. "I burned it entirely to the ground. I dismantled the operations, divested all the assets. I'm not a boss anymore. I'm just a man." Charlotte stared at him, trying incredibly hard to process the sheer, impossible magnitude of what he was saying. "You gave up the entire syndicate. Why? Because of you," he said simply. The raw truth felt terrifyingly exposed. "Because I finally realized the massive empire I was building was nothing but a cage. Because when I held a gun to Vincent Romano's head to save your brother, I realized I absolutely hated the man I had to be to protect the people I cared about." She stepped slowly out from behind the drafting table, approaching him extremely cautiously, as if he were a wild, unpredictable animal that might suddenly snap. "You did all that. You threw away everything. Because of what happened to Julian? I did it because you vividly showed me there was another, better way," Nico said, slowly reaching into his inner jacket pocket. He pulled out a familiar, slightly crumpled, highly worn piece of large paper and gently laid it on the small reception desk. It was her original sketch, the Lombardi Initiative. "The waterfront lot is completely empty," Nico said, his deep voice thick with overwhelming emotion. "The land belongs entirely to a legitimate, charitable trust now. I want you to build it, Charlotte. The community center, the clinic. I want you to build the beautiful legacy you designed." Charlotte looked down at the sketch, her eyes rapidly filling with tears. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers gently tracing the faded pencil lines of her own hopeful drawing. She looked slowly back up at him, intensely searching his dark eyes for the cruel deception she had always expected from him. But she found absolutely none, only deep exhaustion, profound sincerity, and a desperate, beautiful hope. "You really tore it all down," she whispered, the thick defensive walls she had built so high against him finally beginning to crumble. Every last, bloody brick, he promised solemnly. She looked at him for a very long, quiet time, the heavy silence thick with 1,000 unsaid words, with the terrible memory of fear and the tentative, fragile promise of true redemption. She finally saw the vulnerable man buried deep beneath the monster, the man who had willingly traded his entire dark kingdom for a single chance at peace. "It's going to take a massive amount of work," she finally said, her voice barely above a breath, "to build something that incredibly big, to make absolutely sure the foundation is truly clean." "I have the rest of my life," Nico said, taking a final step closer, close enough to finally, wonderfully smell the faint, floral perfume he had never, ever forgotten. "And I'm highly willing to learn how to build." Charlotte looked down at the blueprint one last time, then back up into his eyes. The terror was completely gone, replaced by a highly cautious, incredibly fragile trust. She didn't forgive him instantly. The deep scars of his world were far too profound for a fairy tale ending. But she clearly saw his massive sacrifice, and she intimately recognized the absolute sincerity in his eyes. "Okay," she said softly, a small, genuine smile breaking through her tears. "We'll start with the foundation." It wasn't a perfect, clean fairy tale ending. It was a messy, hopeful beginning, built on the smoldering ashes of a ruined empire, a fragile, hard-won truce that held the beautiful promise of something lasting, designed by the brilliant architect who had dared to stand up to the mob boss and the brave man who had burned his entire world just to stand beside her. 5 incredibly busy, fulfilling years had passed since the rain-slicked afternoon Nico Lombardi walked into the small Oregon architectural firm and surrendered his crown. The Seattle skyline had drastically changed, but certainly not in the terrifying way the city had once feared, where the monolithic, glaring casino was meant to cast its dark shadow over the waterfront. The Viridian Community Center now stood proudly, bathed in golden sunlight. It was an absolute architectural masterpiece of sweeping glass, reclaimed steel, and heavily integrated, lush greenery, built exactly as Charlotte had originally envisioned it in the dead of night. The joyful sounds of local children playing in the expansive public park echoed loudly where heavy construction machinery once roared. Nico stood quietly by the large floor-to-ceiling, energy-efficient windows of his office, a surprisingly modest, warm space located right within the center itself, serving as the hands-on director of the charitable trust that fully funded the massive operation. He wasn't wearing a terrifying, tailored black suit, but a comfortable soft sweater and casual slacks. The hard, cruel lines of his face had remarkably softened over the years. The ever-present, paranoid tension in his broad shoulders was entirely gone. He smiled as he watched the vibrant courtyard below. A large group of teenagers was playing a loud game of basketball on the public courts, and near the thriving community garden, Julian was actively leading a hands-on workshop on urban farming. Julian looked incredibly healthy, vibrant, and, most importantly, 5 years totally sober. A living, breathing testament to the hard-fought second chance they had all bled for. The heavy door behind Nico clicked open. He didn't need to turn around to know exactly who it was. The faint, comforting scent of orchids always preceded her. Charlotte walked in, carrying a large stack of thick files. She looked absolutely radiant, the deep stress of her past struggles entirely replaced by a profound, deeply settled happiness and confidence. The city council just unanimously approved the new expansion budget for the youth clinic, she announced brightly, a beautiful, triumphant smile completely lighting up her face. They absolutely loved the new designs. No bribes required. Nico turned, a warm, incredibly genuine smile spreading across his face. He walked over to her, gently taking the heavy files and setting them carelessly on his desk before wrapping his large arms warmly around her waist, pulling her close. "Of course they did," he murmured, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to her forehead. "You're a brilliant, undeniable architect. I never doubted you for a second." She rested her head comfortably against his broad chest, listening closely to the steady, calm rhythm of his heart. It was a sound she had slowly, carefully learned to trust implicitly. The journey certainly hadn't been easy. The dark, lingering shadows of Nico's violent past had occasionally threatened their hard-won peace, requiring constant vigilance, massive legal battles, and iron will to keep the greedy remnants of the syndicate permanently at bay. But they had faced every single challenge together, building their new life with the exact same meticulous, loving care Charlotte applied to her blueprints. "We did good here, Nico," she said softly, looking out the large window at the thriving, happy community hub they had built from scratch. "You did good," Nico corrected her gently, his voice filled with awe. "You boldly showed me the blueprint when I was blind. I just provided the raw materials. You provided the solid foundation," she countered softly, pulling back just slightly to look deeply into his dark eyes. "You completely tore down your entire life to build this new one with me. That takes infinitely more strength than just designing a building on paper." Nico looked at the incredible woman who had fearlessly challenged him, fought him tooth and nail, and ultimately, beautifully saved him from himself. He had willingly traded an untouchable empire of fear for a quiet kingdom of peace. And he had never, not for a single fraction of a second, regretted the choice. The ruthless, terrifying mob boss was long dead. The man who stood here now was simply a builder, standing proudly beside his brilliant architect. It was, without a doubt, the absolute best investment I ever made, he said, kissing her softly and deeply. The story of Nico Lombardi and Charlotte Martin wasn't a traditional tale of a dark king conquering a bright queen. It was a story of a woman whose unyielding, brilliant light was so incredibly powerful, it forcefully made a man living in absolute darkness realize he vastly preferred the warmth of the sun. It was a powerful reminder that true, lasting power isn't found in brutal control or violent intimidation, but in the profound courage to completely change, to willingly burn down the toxic empires we build, and to start over, brick by brick, with the people who make us desperately want to be better. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible, expanded journey with Nico and Charlotte. If you enjoyed this emotional story of hard-won redemption, unwavering loyalty, and unexpected, transformative love, please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. What was your absolute favorite moment in their journey? Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on that notification bell so you never miss an original storytelling experience. Your continued support allows me to keep creating these deeply emotional, new worlds and complex characters just for you to relax with. Until next time, stay safe, keep building your own foundations, and keep believing in the beautiful power of a second chance.